Hey everyone, Dave Baggett here from Inky. I'm the founder and CEO, and today we'll be talking about BEC and specifically a new tactic attackers are using to fool the mail protection systems. At Inky, we offer mail protection, phishing, malware, spam protection, but today I'll be talking specifically about phishing and this BEC abuse. First, a little bit about me. If you ever played Crash Bandicoot, that was the first startup I was involved in back in the 90s. I was one of the two developers on that game. After that, I co-founded a company called ITA Software, which you probably wouldn't have heard of, but it was acquired by Google in 2010 and is now Google Flights. So if you've used Google Flights, you've used some of my work and also some of the work of some of my colleagues at Inky as well. We founded Inky in 2012, and we've been focusing on phishing and mail protection more broadly since 2015. I don't have to tell this audience how important phishing is. Obviously, phishing is the #1 cybersecurity threat, arguably, according to the Verizon report most recently released. Phishing is the source of about 90+% of publicized breaches. So it is the entry point for most high-profile attacks, whether that's stealing money, according to the FBI in 2020. Public US events led to $4.1 billion of theft. That's wire fraud, gift card fraud, and so on, but also leads to installation of ransomware and other kinds of attacks. Phishing's easy, it's cheap, and it's effective. So it represents now the greatest threat to your company, particularly financial risk. And we've even seen very sophisticated tech companies like Google and Facebook victimized by paying fake invoices to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. So obviously, phishing is arguably the most important problem right now in cybersecurity. It's one of the reasons why we at Inky decided to focus on it. And today, I will show you a little bit about what the attackers are now doing to get their BEC mails through more effectively. And one of the things we talk about in computer science is you can solve almost any problem by adding a layer of indirection. And what that means is you add an extra layer, and here the attackers are doing exactly that. So the historical way that a BEC attack would work is the attacker sends the victim a mail, appears to be from a person or brand they know. It includes a link that's bad. In other words, the link points to a website that's hosting malicious content like malware, or has a credential harvesting fake login page, or the mail includes an attachment which itself is malware or has some Office document that has an exploit. And obviously this is the direct mechanism. The attacker embeds right in the mail the bad content. The new flow, adding the layer of indirection, the extra pointer, as it were, is the mail itself doesn't contain the bad link or the bad file. Instead, it contains a link to a cloud service, which then hosts the bad link or the bad file. And so the reason this works is, of course, most mail protection systems, including Inky's. Inky uses a bunch of techniques beyond this, but certainly includes this set of techniques of look at all the URLs in the mail and see if any of them have been reported as phishing. Look at all the attachments and see if any of them are in VirusTotal. This is an effective way for the attackers to avoid those checks because, of course, those bad links and those bad files that are reported are not in the mail itself. They're hosted on the cloud service. So we're going to go through 3 examples today. These are all real world examples. And these are all ones that we've redacted PII, but otherwise haven't really altered. And I'll dissect them and go through their exact mechanism of action. And you'll see they don't just use this indirection technique. They also use some other clever tactics. If you're interested in the specific tactics, by the way, you can go to inky.com and look up our Understanding Phishing series. We use in that series, we take that as an opportunity to go through more than a dozen tactics we've seen attackers use essentially as they come out, and then document them and also explain how we provide countermeasures against them. But first, just to sort of highlight the magnitude of the problem, this is, we've processed about 1 billion mails over the last several years. These are recent stats from the last quarter. You're seeing thousands and tens of thousands of phishing mails abusing these cloud services. Microsoft and Google are obviously the #1 and 2 you can see here, but I think actually most important is the ones toward the bottom, like Quip, Alchemer. You may not even have heard of these. Some of these are either less used or they are up and coming growing services. and we're seeing that they are getting abused by phishers as well. Here's the first example, and if you look at that blurry logo on the lower left, we've blurred that because it's PII. But in the original mail, this looked like a perfect company logo for the sender's company. Now, this was an account takeover. So someone took over a third-party account and sent this mail to one of our customers' users. And the mail looked essentially correct because it had the sending company's correct branding there. Again, we blurred it so you can't see it, but that would have not been blurred in the original example. And this uses a technique we call fake attachment. And we have an Understanding Phishing series on this, but I'll summarize it. Fake attachment is where the attacker embeds an image literally as an attachment to the email that they then reference in the HTML. You can see there's the arrow is pointing to some text there that starts with CID : that stands for content ID. That's a way to include attachments as imagery in the HTML. And so this is done so that even if you have remote content disabled on your Outlook for your users, any CID, content ID attachment image will appear anyway because it's referencing an attachment to the mail. And the attachment to the mail is not a PDF. You might think it's a PDF because you see that there. That image there of those two PDF icons is just that. It's an image. It's simply an image the attacker has embedded in the mail. There are no PDF attachments here, but that's convincing enough, especially if they're using Outlook, that if the user is induced to click on it, they're taken to this survey.alchemer.com site. And that's a survey site where you can create surveys for users. I guess it's kind of like SurveyMonkey. But again, it's available to the public to host things. And you can see here what the attacker's done is make a survey that isn't really a survey at all. It appears to be a login page. So it's a fake Microsoft Office 365 login page. It's a credential harvesting operation. So essentially, the attackers have hosted a credential harvesting operation on this Alchemer site. Pretty clever. Here's the next one I wanted to dive into. You see, as usual, very commonly we see this. There's some urgency, immediate action. We see a lot of this. And it links to a OneDrive site, right? Again, we blurred everything here to hide the PI, but this all looked really legitimate as though it was from the real sender. Again, this is a taken over account. So the recipient of this could plausibly believe it was real. And the mail protection system, when faced with this OneDrive.live.com URL, I mean, it can't really know anything about that. There's no likelihood that's going to appear in some threat feed. Inky, actually, we chase these and we actually go and visit the cloud services to try to counter this kind of indirection technique. But most mail protection systems are not doing that yet. So again, this is a very effective way to launder malicious URLs through cloud services. And let's take a look at what's hosted there. This looks like a OneDrive page. In other words, part of the OneDrive user experience. But that again is a ruse. This is simply a PDF that embeds the OneDrive logo. So that's not OneDrive saying OneDrive, that's the PDF, which just happens to have an image that says OneDrive. And of course, it has a prominent call to action. So here, the attackers are cleverly hosting a PDF, which appears to be a OneDrive prompt page, which then, when they click through, takes them to this pre-schoolpower.live malware document. Final example is this one, which abuses Google in several ways, actually. And we see here the common framing of these phishing emails. Hey, this is something really important for you to know from HR or payroll. In the HR case, it might be, here's the COVID-19 policy, the back to work policy. In this case, it's great news, you got a bonus. Then log in here and of course authenticate here and get the information about your bonus. And again, this is what we call a dynamic phish. All that blurred stuff is completely targeted to this victim so that it's all plausible. You know, that person's name, who is supposedly the payroll processor assistant, is a real person in the company that the user would recognize. And one of the reasons this is so feasible, it's actually easy for attackers now, is the attackers are just using bots to scrape LinkedIn. So everything that your company's employees have on LinkedIn, assume that will all be used against you robotically to fill in forms like these templates. They're almost like evil Mad Libs to phish your users. So what happens when they go to this Google Drive doc? They're again presented with what looks like a Google page. In other words, a Google user experience page, part of Google Drive. You know, if you're an end user and you don't use Google Drive a lot, this seems totally plausible. It's got a giant Google logo. It helpfully tells you the file's been scanned and is status safe. And it has a call to action. Click here. This is just a doc. This is the same thing we saw in the previous example done with a PDF, only here it's done with a doc. So that Google image just appears inside of a doc. There's no Google hosting here other than the person's abusing Google Drive to host a Word doc, essentially. And as an aside, that file has been scanned safe with the green safe. We see a variant of this very commonly in emails. If you've been following Inky, you know that we pioneered the concept of dynamic color-coded banners in email that give users guidance. Now, typically our banners would be yellow to tell the user, hey, you know, this might not be the Dave you think it is, or it might tell the user, hey, this looks like a wire request, don't wire money without confirming outside of email, some kind of guidance or real-time training. We don't actually have the concept of a green banner, but we see attackers embedding their own green banner that looks a lot like our banner. And so we've developed countermeasures where we actually look for those fake green banners, and that'll tell us the mail's malicious. So here's just a variant of that where the attacker's putting in this guidance to the user that's completely wrong. This is not, in fact, safe. It's totally malicious, but the attacker might, having seen these kinds of things before, think, oh, that means it's safe, so I'm good. The other clever technique this uses, which we're seeing increasingly, is the abuse of google.com itself as a redirector. So if you look at that link closely, you'll see it really is a link pointing to google.com, and then there's this set of arguments after the initial google.com URL question mark, that stuff. That's simply using Google itself as a general purpose redirector. And so it's redirecting to this checkupdate2020.com site. I'll mention that was probably registered with Namecheap. The attackers use it because it's cheap, but also because you can register domains and pay for them with Bitcoin. And checkupdate2020.com, we see these very often. They're very plausible. So if the user scrutinizes that, they're like, yeah, that might be a real Microsoft or Google domain. Sure, it could be. In fact, what this does is it takes you to malware that installs the Ryuk ransomware. So this, in fact, highlights the entire problem of phishing. It often comes bearing ransomware. So it's worth thinking about, given these three examples, the larger implications here. We don't know the solution to this other than deploy software which can, like Inky, you know, scrutinize not just the mail itself, but the things that are pointed to by the mail. So actually we'll go and visit these sites and scrutinize the content there. But there's some policy questions here, like these sites probably need to be better at policing this content. It's not clear they really take responsibility for that yet. The other thing that we found is that some of these sites let you set up accounts without any kind of email or phone verification. So there's really no way to trace these back to the attackers. That's a problem. And then I think most devastatingly, we found that a number of these newer services, they have no way to even report abuse. So we don't even have a way when we find an example like this to report it to these systems. And that's clearly something that has to change. So obviously there's a lot of policy implications of this, but hopefully you've learned from today how these attacks work, and hopefully you enjoyed it. So visit us at inky.com for more. Thank you.